Hello, everybody, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And let's jump right in. I think we're expecting more and more people to join in the next 5 minutes, but let's get started here. We are here with what should be a really exciting session on design thinking in urban planning. I mean, that's a title that we are starting off with, but I'm sure it's going to seek into a lot of interesting discussions. We have two stalwarts from the industry to help us make sense of this approach towards urban planning. Whether does it work or is it required? What needs to be fixed, etc. Right. So before we jump into the discussion, let me quickly introduce our panelists. Not that they need a lot of introduction, but we must do that for people that might not be fully aware of, where our two guests come from. So let me start with Anirban. Anirban is one of India's foremost design thinking leaders, and he's a founder at UBQT, four letters, UBQT Design School, as well as the Painted Sky, which is an organization that specializes in differentiated behavioral and skill development programs. He leverages his many years of his deep industry experience with a lot of field knowledge to conduct senior level training programs covering topics such as leadership, creative and innovative thinking, vision alignment, or critical problem solving, which is really critical, and change and conflict management. He's conducted design thinking based training for various organizations like TCS, Robert Bosch, Samsung, Fidelity, Accenture, Cleartrip, and Mondelez, among many, many others. So welcome, Anirban.
Thank you, Gautam.
Naresh Narsimhan is the principal and CEO at Venkataramanan Associates, an award-winning and one of India's leading architecture and urban design firms, and they're based here in Bangalore. They've recently completed 50 years of operations, and our heartiest congratulations to you and your team, Naresh, on that. Naresh is an urbanist and he's an activist, and he's been a part of the Bangalore Agenda Task Force, as many of you might be aware, and has advised many government bodies on urban planning. And while there are several projects to count, a few notable ones include the building that we are sitting in right now, the Brigade Gateway, which houses the iconic World Trade Center in Bangalore, the first software park in India with Infosys, the Loop and R&D Center, and the recent redevelopment of Church Street in Bangalore for those of you who live here. So welcome, Naresh, and welcome, gentlemen. Now, before we jump into the discussion, I would like to remind all the attendees that the question channel is open through the hour. So do send in your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom, and we'll bring it up with our panel through the talk or towards the end of it. So let's get started, Apul.
All right. Hey, thanks, Gautam, and welcome once again, Naresh and Anirban. Looking forward to an exciting conversation. So let me start at the very basic. Design thinking has several definitions. It's a style of strategy that originated from architecture and interior design and reaches worlds far beyond these disciplines. It's almost become a buzz phrase that's been liberally sort of thrown around these days in almost all verticals. So Anirban, for laymen like us, can you simplify this and give a layman's view of what design thinking really stands for?
Well, Paul, that was nicely put. It has been sprayed around and it is a buzzword. I'll agree to both of those. I think design thinking, you're right, has many definitions. Many people look at it in different ways. The way I look at it, based on what we have done so far, coming from a non-design but a business background and entering design thinking, is I prefer the other name for design thinking, human-centered design, which essentially puts the human in the tech space is often, I would say, reduced to a user, but I don't like that word too much. It's putting the human being at the center of your problem-solving process. Essentially, too often what we do, and when we work with everyone from alphabetically from an Accenture to a Xerox, our problem solving often is about what is the process or what is the product or what is the system we have, and let's solve for that. Let's improve that. We tend to often forget that there's a human being who would be using that, and the human being has certain realities. right from abilities to use a product, to physical constraints, to environment, to context, all kinds of things come. So design thinking, in a nutshell, pushes the envelope into that domain, saying, forget what your product or your building or whatever you're wanting to build and whatever your priorities are for building that. Think about the human being who is going to enjoy or not enjoy what you're going to end up building. So design thinking, yes, it's become a kind of a buzzword. I think you're being kind and not calling it a fad. Uh, the reason being, of course, that, it's been around for a long time. I mean, literature-wise, if you go back, I mean, there are traces of design thinking you can find in the 1960s. But I think in the last 20 odd years, with the arrival of the tech giants, it's become very popular because you realize that just not that it starts by looking at the way you started to look at design as, is it just aesthetics? Is it just ergonomics? Or is it the box or what the box does for you?
True.
And by that, I mean, you need to understand the human being who uses it. So there's a strong focus on empathy, which you arrive at through a process of discovery. We spend a lot of time in observation, immersion, contextual engagements, etc., to understand people in their context and to understand what are their real needs, interests, motivations, fears, all kinds of stuff. And then the other pivot of design thinking is constant experimentation. So it's almost like an agile approach to problem solving. You fail fast, fail forward. You're constantly creating prototypes, testing them with real users, and developing a product or a solution that can move forward constantly. So it's a key driver for continuous innovation that we find across the world, which is why some of the largest brands, largest organizations, from a Pepsi to a Samsung to an Accenture to a Honeywell, you name it, are applying design thinking today. Now, yes, you mentioned that design thinking does have a background in three spaces, I call it. Industrial design, where fundamentally the principles come from, architecture, and yes, understanding the user of a space before you try to design a space, maybe, and hugely into psychology, the why behind people's buying decisions. So it has a lot of analytics, cultural anthropology, getting deeper into understanding the human psyche, the biases, unconscious, cognitive, all kinds of stuff. So it all comes together to hopefully create solutions that people can use and get better experiences. So that's my, not a definition, but
But I think you sort of gave us an overview of how it has evolved and what is design thinking today. So Naresh, I think Anirban did touch upon interiors and industrial design and architects. So architects design for people who will inhabit the physical spaces, right? So they'll live there, while user experience and product designers are focused on users who will interact with the digital world. Both designers go through a process or a framework, if I was to sort of take it that way. What are your thoughts on design thinking as a framework? Has it really worked for real estate and architecture design in your experience?
I might have a slightly contrarian view to what Anirban has to say.
Sure.
Design thinking is often peddled, often touted as the panacea to solve any problem in the world. Right? It's like a overall, like almost like a framework in which, by following a series of defined steps, right? Saying that you go through step A, B, I think Anirban mentioned some of them. The whole idea of empathize, define, etc., etc. I won't go through it. Anybody, you Google design thinking and about some 9 million websites pop up. I won't go through exactly what it is. But what is important to understand, and I have gone through this framework earlier, I mean, in full disclosure, is that I also am the chairman of a innovation consulting company called Numa, which offers similar kind of content to companies to work on design thinking methodologies. It has its uses, but what people don't sometimes fail not to understand is that two fundamental insights is that design is not a linear process, right? Design is like playing 3D chess. When you make a move, chess moves, particularly if you know the knight move, the move of the knight in chess is 2 up, 1 right, or 2 sideways and 1 up, etc. Would be in colloquial language. In Kannada, the word for horse is kudre, so we call it the kudre move, which is the view when you think that you are getting stuck. Sometimes the knight move in chess is sometimes what you need, and that's not a linear move. And it's design thinking emphasizes that you go through a series. I mean, Anirban is already nodding his head, saying that I disagree with you. But the classical definition of design thinking is it goes step A to step B to step C, and somehow feels that, somehow makes the statement that by using the user experience sometimes informs the outcome of a design process. Not necessarily true. Sometimes people have no idea what they want. And if you use that as a fundamental input to do design, sometimes there is also a statement, particularly in coding terminology, called GIGO, which means garbage in will result in garbage out, which is also another cliche, not particularly true. I think the most important insight I have got from design thinking up to now is that it is one more methodology. It is not the only methodology. There are multiple other ways in which design, particularly in real estate, what happens is that a project, typically a large project, like what we and your company Brigade does, is typically a 4 or 5 year engagement. It's not a product which can be quickly, rapidly prototyped 20 times and introduced into the market 5 months later. And we, unfortunately, in real estate and construction, do not have the economics or the time or the patience to sit and do multiple prototypes of a product in physicality. We can do it virtually, but when we do it virtually, it is too much smaller scale, and it's not easy to understand or imagine it. You need sometimes the experience to imagine what it will look like when it's actually built at 100% full size. And many times also that these projects that we build last about 30, 40 years easily. No? The first buildings I built when I started my career more than 30 years ago are still being nicely inhabited and used strongly even today. It is difficult to imagine what a project will be 30, 40 years from now, and to be able to design for that kind of outcome. So let us see. I mean, I feel that the iterative process of design thinking is not sometimes 100% suited to the design and real estate world. It may be, at least from a product point of view, from a physical product point of view. It might work in various other situations, which I'm sure Anirban will tell us more about, where many people ask, to give you an item, what is the difference between architecture and sculpture? Right? So what's the fundamental difference? The only fundamental difference is that you can walk around the sculpture, but in architecture, the building is around you. So it's very difficult to have 360-degree vision, right? To understand. And that is why you are trained to be an architect, to be able to develop that sense of what is behind your head. And no amount of users telling you what is behind your head will give you the insight to do that. And not only that, I think sometimes the word innovation itself has become like the buzzword of, the late 90s and the early, this part of this century, this millennium. And sometimes I think people have forgotten simpler words like think hard, or maybe sometimes people have forgotten words like, maybe, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I would stop there, but I would say that maybe some sense of invention is required to be able to take the world forward rather than innovation. And everybody jumps on this innovation as a incrementally improving circumstance. Sometimes the world needs to think of something brand new, and that's very difficult to come up with something brand new using a linear process.
Okay. Okay. Interesting perspective. Anirban, Naresh definitely seems, design thinking is yet another framework, not a big proponent or so it seems. Can
I'm
you
not saying
share?
it's a. I'm not saying it's a bad in conception. I'm saying that it is not the only
Only,
framework as
yes.
it is being for innovation as it's being touted to be.
Uh,
I feel that there's many other things. There are many other tools which you use to come to
right.
a solution, including one famous tool called intuition, which people have forgotten.
Hmm.
True. So what I thought is, Anirban, good point for good time for you to probably, I think how do you define success as a design thinker? How do you any relevant or adjacent cases, where you've seen success, which is to the real estate industry? I mean, why do projects fail? I think it'd be good to sort of get some balance here to understand that.
Well, thank you, Apple. And Naresh, that was very nicely put. I was smiling because actually there was a lot of agreement in what you were saying that I was finding. But Apple, before I address that, it'll be criminal of me not to kind of address some of the points that Naresh raised.
Fair
Okay.
enough. Yeah.
So I think what Naresh pointed out is somewhat of a very conventional and a traditional Google searched worldview of design thinking. And unfortunately, we've kind of moved on beyond that in the last 10 odd years that I've been in this space. Ever since I studied it, then I went back and studied again last year. I noted down of some of the words and I would love to kind of quickly address them before I move to your point. To Naresh's first point that it's a very linear process, well, it is not at all. If it is taught that way anywhere or any serious approach to applying design thinking, even remotely considers it to be a linear process where step A follows step B, is absolutely rubbish. We often start with step 5 and then work backwards. And while we are on step 3, we realize we don't understand step 2 yet. So it's absolutely the 3D chess is probably a good analogy, and it might surprise you, but that's exactly what design thinking works at. For the sake of education of design thinking, you kind of draw them out in a sequence. But I have rarely, in whatever 10 years that I've been in the space, working with so many clients, in a project level, ever seen us stick to a linear process where, you do a define and then you do ideate. And during ideate, you don't discover that your problem definition is wrong. So you go back and rethink that. While you're defining the problem, you'll realize you don't have enough data to define it correctly. So you go back and talk to some more people, etc., and going back and forth. So I think that's something to kind of think of. I think that's how design thinking is rapidly evolving. And because of which I think design thinking's power is in what is being called solving wicked problems. To the other point, I think completely agree with Naresh that design thinking is being bandied around as this panacea that can solve everything from your, economy to your constipation. I wouldn't say that. Okay, we say that design thinking works best when you do not have a clear line of sight between the problem and the solution, and they're applying something which spends time to collaboratively create solutions by diving deep to understand the problem first is a key element of design thinking. I think the biggest driver for success, and I work with companies all around where traditionally they spend billions of dollars building new solutions or products, and many of them fail. They fail because while the solution looks good, they haven't figured out the right problem. And that's where design thinking comes in. To me, the power of design thinking isn't finding the right problem to solve. Most cases, people have the talent, the skill, the technology, or the money to find a solution. The other point is that people often don't know what they want is, again, something that I've heard. I mean, if I could get $1 for every time I've heard that. Yes, they don't. And which is why in design thinking, we never go and ask them, what would you like to see? We try to understand what are they experiencing today and try to understand what's missing. You understand that people don't have an understanding of the solution for you, but people can tell you what problems they are facing or what's missing in their life, which could be an opportunity to solve for. And the world is full of examples where by understanding that opportunity, that gap that exists, you might come up with a solution that can work. Companies like an Uber or an Airbnb essentially are products of that kind of thinking. And finally, the point about intuition. Well, Naresh, I'm sure it will delight you. We try to really push for intuition because while, there are different ways of looking at it. When I run design thinking for engineering firms who love to believe that 2 and 2 add up to 4, there are requirements for structures and, algorithms that kind of define success. But when we step back and realize that we have to design, let's say, an organization's culture, or how do you enhance employee engagement, or how do you, really solve critical problems which are not easy to solve for, you realize intuition is what drives your solution making, right? And there again, the word innovation does come in because yes, I'm a big fan of invention, but invention, the difference is innovation makes an invention work in the marketplace. It makes an invention workable. And that's how I always define it. I think now the final point is I am not an expert in real estate. So I'm going to step back right off the pedal right now saying you and Naresh, you guys know far more about the real estate business, how urban planning, etc. work. I know some cases. I've seen how people like an Amanda Burden has done the zoning for New York City so that every new housing project is 10 minutes from urban transport access. Or now she's done the Highline, project where it's a constant fight reclaiming it from developers. I remember when I went to school in design thinking, a project that was a very hot one that time was for how design thinking helped develop better communities in the city of Dublin. And as recently as I think 2018 or 19, somebody who was somebody's work I follow, a gentleman called Christopher Hawthorne was signed up as the chief design officer for the city of Los Angeles, essentially bringing the same design thinking principles to designing urban spaces. So I think if you Google search, maybe you won't find 9 million hits, but probably you'll get about 9,000 hits about how real estate, urban planning, and urban design is using design thinking. I think it's our conventional thinking. I mean, it's not in real estate. Again, I don't know about the nitty-gritties of the real estate market, so I'm going to stay out of that for that period. But my experience working with retail to healthcare, I've worked with governments, redesigning education curriculum, working with bureaucrats, working streets of the city to figure out what makes a child come to a government school or not, and how to motivate the mother and what she looks for. So I think we have had brilliant skeptics always. I think all change faces skepticism because there's resistance. But it's like LIC moving for computerization. You realize that the world is changing, new technologies are coming in, new customers are coming in who are no longer just interested in rental or your margins. They look for other things. So I think we are constantly facing those challenges. And so I don't know if that will honestly work in real estate. Maybe it won't. Naresh would be a far better judge than that. But what we've seen is that we may have to design or define our success differently. If your definition of success is, rental or margins or lower cost savings, etc., versus in design thinking, definition of success is satisfaction, experience, value that you're creating for human beings. Question that, is your city meant for cars, builders, or citizens? So, those are fundamental questions, tough questions. And I'm not sure whether all industries are ready, but I can safely tell you that over a period of time, if we have this conversation in 5 years, when Naresh is celebrating 55 years of his company, chances are we might have a different conversation.
All right, so I'm gonna pencil that in about 5 years later. Thanks, Anirban.
But I'm really curious about failures. I mean, there is a lot of friction toward design thinking in many quarters. Why do you think projects fail, Anirban? I think, have you dialed into that in the many different projects that you've been involved in? About at what point do you pull out, and why do these things not work? Go all the way.
When you talk of projects, you mean real estate, urban projects?
Not real estate. Any intervention that you've done from a design thinking paradigm.
Right. I think when we work in design thinking, I think one of the things that we have to understand is, when you're building a product, when you're shipping a product, for instance, to use a technology jargon, Your definition of success is probably linked to sales, probably linked to margins that come from it, etc. Penetration, whatever. I think whenever you are building a thing or a system, your measure of success is defined by that. Success and failure get defined by that. So when we come in at two levels, fundamentally. One is in terms of helping organizations build better solutions. Often enough, whether they are working in rural healthcare to, e-commerce solutions to hospital space design to school space, whatever you are thinking of, we are trying to understand why the problem exists. And I think the conversation should fundamentally start with that. I mean, in spite of all efforts to build products, services, you have got so many beautiful buildings. Would you consider all of them successful? Is the question I would ask you also. Because at the end of the day, whenever you have a finite output, there's a conversation around success and failure, kind of. There's a binary that comes in. Now, when you look at it slightly differently, what happens is you start thinking that what we're trying to change is not just about the success or failure of a product, is also the way people think. If you start thinking that can you develop a mindset that is constantly curious and is constantly wanting to know from people how their current experiences are, empathizing essentially, does that lead you to get to better insights as to what matters to people? And that leads you to ideation, prototyping, blah, blah, all of that happens. But it changes the fundamental way you approach problem solving. And therefore, we use the term very often, Gautam, in our language. It's called continuous innovation. Is that you look at success or failure from a perspective of a continuum, that whatever you're building is a prototype for a better version. Today, if Apple launches iPhone 12, it doesn't mean that the first 11 have failed. They are helping Apple create the 12th and somewhere probably the 35th iPhone that will eventually show up on your desk. So I think that's the first element of that. So I think for us defining success, and okay, so that's one part of it. The second part of it is why we have seen this, I would say, exponential rise in demand for design thinking, is because when you are in this, again, another bandied word, VUCA world of uncertainty and complexity, etc., you don't have a straightforward answer to a question. You don't know the dynamics. So for instance, if tomorrow your customer is going to buy something where he's only interested in in your carbon footprint and not in the product feature or the product's performance, most product, and I'm not sure about real estate, but are you capable of thinking of that when you're designing something or focusing on that? Maybe you are, I'm not sure. So what we end up thinking of that is that bring in all of those people into the conversation. Bring in customers, bring in stakeholders into a co-creation process end to end. Those people who we are empathizing with are helping us are brainstorming with us. When we are prototyping, we often leave it incomplete and ask them to come and help us build up. If it's a mock-up, if it's a room, if it's a hospital corridor, which again we have designed for people who are visually challenged, we would ask people to walk in that corridor to tell us, how do you feel about it? So what happens therefore is if you are engaging your stakeholder through the design process, the chances of them rejecting your product or service or solution down at the end, when they have had such a strong say in the design process or development process itself, is remote. So it's not that we have had 100% success, but the chances of success come down. We have seen that. And now success and failure, of course, works in terms of whether they work in the market finally. And there are multiple factors in which we would say that it may not work and the product could have other problems as well. So we have seen perspectives in terms of defining success itself change, applying design thinking.
Okay. So I have a couple of questions. Let me now sort of, focus down a little more on the urban planning and the role that technology can play in design thinking. So Naresh, urban planning has been a bit of ad hoc in India. You've got lakes catching fire, flooding, waterlogging in cities, development of metro, the discussion surrounding, say, for example, the steel bridge, right? Now, is this really sustainable from a design point of view? Can technology, aspects of technology help our cities be better planned and designed? What role do you think tech can play here?
It's actually the other way around. Actually, everybody thinks that the magic wand of technology and is a magic wand which will somehow fix our cities. All we have to do is deploy 20 apps and then the city will get fixed or something like that. All that happens with all the apps I've seen till now is that you can take a photograph of a pothole and the message will go to the commissioner and nothing will happen. Only the ISP will make some money in the whole thing. I mean, roughly the idea of technology is that it's become rather simplistic and thinking that it's solving the problem. The real elephant in the room in urban planning is the inability, or what I would call the inexcusable hesitance of professionals to engage with politics. It's a fundamental. We all think that just because we are professionals, politicians have to listen to us. Politicians, frankly, don't care what you think. On the other hand, and we think that this politics is a dirty game. Who will get involved in the hurly-burly of daily life, dealing with people? When Anirban puts out a statement saying, listen to people and what do they really want, and use that as a the word people there also is defined by whom you can communicate with. There is a implicit and implicit thing that the user of a product that you're designing is literate enough or of the same social class as you to be able to give you meaningful feedback. However, when you design for a city, you're designing for a whole bunch of people who do not possess what I call civic literacy. I mean, all of us have some idea how to live in a city. You don't throw trash out of your car window when you drive. You willfully don't leave the tap open when you shave. You willfully don't waste food if you can, etc., etc. Right? I mean, there are certain unsaid rules and unsaid conventions that you all follow. You try telling this to a whole bunch of people whose social realities are very different from yours. You will find that you will become a hit a wall, particularly when it comes to urban planning situations. Using tech as a solution tool is very, very difficult in these kind of circumstances. Tech as a data collection tool is starting to make an impact. For instance, if you see the recent floods in Bangalore, the flood was predicted 24 hours in advance by using sensor technologies, which started sensing that the water level is rising and started, communicating with the authorities that not after the fact, but almost about 4 hours, 5 hours before it happened, it started coming up with the answer. But the fundamental thing is that if you're really willing to get your, I don't want to use the wrong metaphor, if you're really willing to get your hands down and, as they call it in other things, down and dirty, in the sense that you are willing to engage with the ground at the ground level, right? Not at most urban planning is done at the 100,000 foot level. You're flying above look at a Google map of the city and decide either this is what will happen here, that's what will happen there. And if it doesn't work that way, it's a tough luck kind of approach. And a lot of it is also driven by, people don't understand that most city divisions they're called wards typically, right? In a city, or boroughs or wards. In Bangalore and Bombay, I think they're called wards. And maybe in Delhi, they're called mohallas or some other name, right? Most of those do not follow geographical divisions because of the fundamental nature of our politics. The fundamental nature of a politics says that every area, which is a unit of voting, a ward or a constituency, must roughly have the same amount of people of voting age, and also roughly the same social composition, which reflects the diversity of this country, which is a very, very difficult thing to do. There is a process going on in Bangalore called the delimitation of wards. The number of wards in Bangalore are rising from 198 to 243. And let me tell you that I have been attending a few of those meetings to understand, particularly if you can be able to, whether you're able to even use a design tool to be able to understand this. And it is fundamentally, you notice that people do not want to engage with politicians. And so ours has become a very representative democracy rather than a participative one. Unless you move from a representative democracy to saying that, there is a term in, particularly in information technology, called the tragedy of the commons. I'm not sure whether you're aware of this term. It's used more as a thing saying that, but actually the term is more apt for town planning, where we think that, in India, the indoors, for instance, Gautam, the building you're sitting in, on a scale of 10 compared to any building in the world, I think it's a 9, right? It's as good as any building on the planet in terms of quality of I would give it a 10, but I, being the architect, should not be so, I would give it a 9. But you know what happens the moment you step out of your 5-star hotel or a fancy office building onto the street? The footpath breaks down, there's sewage flowing in an open gutter, things are falling apart, and you wonder, what is the brain that created what is behind you, and why did the brain stop the moment it comes here? Fundamentally, my issue is with these is that we will not succeed in doing urban planning in India or urban design in India unless we learn to engage with politicians. A classic example of this, I learned to my great, you already pointed it out that I did Church Street, right? It took 2 years of planning and talking to every stakeholder. And many of them, in India, the stakeholders don't come, they come with the pointy end of the stake in their hands, waiting to poke it into you. That is the definition of stakeholder in India. So it took almost 2 years of thinking how to, and it's not that you can deal with only the political party in power. You also have to look at the heir apparent, which is the other side, the opposition. You also have to look at, the traders on the street. You have to look at the users on the street. But if you go and ask them a direct question, they will all say no. I mean, day before yesterday, after 2.5 years after the street opened, okay, finally we managed to convince everybody to keep the street pedestrian for 36 hours a week. That is Saturday afternoon to Sunday night. And it took about 6 months of planning to do that. So the fundamental truth again and again I want to iterate is that if you want to reform planning in India, understand that there is a politics in everything, not just in governance. There is politics in a cooperative society. There is politics in a shopkeepers association. There is politics between you and 4 of us when we're talking together. There is a politics of conversation between us. If the more we understand the fundamental roots of political science, design will come much easier.
So Naresh, I have a follow-up question there. I understand the political part that you're saying, but I think when I talk about tech, it doesn't necessarily, and that's one of the perception about it just being apps. See, there are companies. I mean, what I meant was, I think, that's a valid point though, right? But there are companies which are sort of, getting away with, for example, no power, no maintenance, sewage treatment plant, or water management, or cleaning our lakes, or no manual scavenging, or purifying the air, right? Now, all of these are fundamental blocks basis which urban planning can happen.
Absolutely.
But we don't, how should smaller companies sort of embrace this concept and be able to make that, I mean, this is a question for...
But all these things that you're using, all these things that you're saying are not fundamental design frameworks. They're all design tools. They're tools for design. Like for instance, we have completely shifted over to drone-based, LiDAR-based surveys, right? Nice. They're particularly useful when you cannot go into disputed areas. You just fly over them and pull out whatever data you want. Right. We have started and many of the other technologies that you're talking about, for instance, no power sewage treatment plants work at a very small scale. They don't work even at a community level well enough yet. They're still an evolutionary path. It works at a cluster of homes or maybe an apartment building. It does not work at a millions of liters of sewage per day level.
There are ones who are sort of doing at lake levels also. I mean, you're right. It's starting to get there.
It's an evolutionary thing. It's not yet quite there. And 3, you also find that tools are only help you refine a framework, which is what I think one of the DT tools particularly is refine what you keep thinking about. Tools help you do that, but it does not solve the fundamental social construct in which unless you're able to, I don't know if Anirban can come up with a way to convince people that the outdoors of India is as much theirs as their indoors. Right? You start over. This is a fundamental truth in many Western countries. Right? You find that people own their outdoors. They literally will get annoyed if you even touch their footpath, or if there is any block in this thing. And in India, you'll find that the outdoors, we feel it's some other problem, which is why you have unregulated street vending. You have street dogs running around in feral packs, threatening you all over the place, with votaries for and against them, because we don't think that the outdoors belongs to us. And that's a societal change, right? Many other third world countries or developing countries, take countries like Turkey, or even many countries in Africa, you never find the kind of garbage that you find casually heaped up in Bangalore all over the place. You don't find anything at all in anywhere else. What is so great about that country's psyche or developmental evolution, that they are able to keep a clean country and we are not? Like somebody told me the other day that Singapore is a fine city. They fine you for everything. Now they fine you if you chew gum also. That's why it's a fine city. I don't know whether that kind of culture even will work in India. Everybody's willing. I saw the other day, yesterday, marshals were fining people for not wearing a mask. And everybody is paying the fine, but nobody is taking out the mask and wearing it, which is a strange country, right? You rather pay for the mistake rather than fix the mistake in the first place. So it's a lot of psychology.
Absolutely. Can I add?
Yeah, I think Anirban wanted to hear your thoughts on that. Yeah.
Go ahead, Anirban.
What Naresh said is absolutely so true. Completely agree with him. At two levels. First of all, I think I'm also somebody, or we've seen this in our work, that this quickly jumping to find a tool or finding a solution is actually counterproductive, because we end up focusing on the wrong solution. Or we build a solution, invest in a solution, and then it is like the Kyarpuram bridge is what you end up with. And I say that I've been in Bangalore for 15 years and I've aged 45 years under that bridge. So to me, the fact is, and to go back to what Naresh was saying about participative democracy, 100% in agreement. It is that, Ashish Nandi had many years ago called India a suffocracy, where we show up. Our understanding of democracy is that we come up one day for a vote. That's it. And that also if you choose to do that in a city. But I'm not going to get into that. I think I can't top what Naresh has just said, and he said it beautifully. I think what in design thinking, or our approach to design thinking is, and when we work with, let's say, government agencies, is that we actually ask the why question. We go and try and understand why is it that people feel the way they do. To us, in design thinking, we kind of, at least my philosophy in design thinking comes from the understanding of human emotions that drive human actions, right? I think the understanding the triggers. So if you look at it from that perspective, is that what is the trigger that leads people to pay a bribe or throw garbage, etc. Now, a very straightforward answer could be whatever is, tactical, what is superficial. But if we have to really bring up a systemic change, we have to go deeper and understand where this is coming from. The behavior can give us clues to the causes of that behavior, which could be awareness, education, you name it. It's not that we have absolutely failed to change behavior. Our successes are few and far between, I would agree. But I think the point here and I won't say, I'm absolutely sure about this to say this, I'm not saying that design thinking is this magic bullet that will solve it for you. That tomorrow, if you train everyone in design thinking, they'll all become model citizens. No. But what if we understand design thinking, and when I do my projects or when we do classes, we say to people, don't worry about a toolkit. Don't worry about this algorithm that you will use to finally zero down on the best solution that you must prototype. That's not the point. Figure out developing your mindset to understand stakeholders. And by stakeholders, I do mean, I'll give you an example, and it's not a real estate example, but it's an education example. When we worked with government schools, we discover that the teacher, the student, and the principal are just minor players in the overall picture. You start by understanding the BDO to the local counselor, to the mother of the child, to the wife of the teacher, to the principal's daughter. And all of these people have a role to play in the kind of education experience somebody ends up getting in a grassroots level school. We obviously, with our technology-driven classrooms, can't even imagine that. But we have experienced that, we've seen that. So again, to us, the question goes down to why is the situation this way? And you go deeper and you engage and you observe. So again, I think I don't have an answer directly to your real estate or urban planning answer, but honestly, I've been a great fan of the work. Again, I name Amanda Burden here. You should check out how she has used design thinking in urban planning in New York City. And Roy Strickland, the University of Michigan professor in urban planning. His phenomenal work in urban planning. So again, I think you will find some great inspirations. I can only point you to those. That's my trainer professorial role coming in maybe, but honestly, that's where I have to stop.
No, I think fair enough. I think we're Gautam. You may want to. I know you
Yeah.
have a couple of
So I
questions.
was. Yeah. No discussion is complete these days without COVID-19 making a some kind of an entry into it, and I think it's relevant though as a part of this discussion. So the pandemic has definitely forced a lot of behavioral changes everywhere, right? I mean, it's the new normal is now the normal, and for let's say for employees to head back to their physical offices or shoppers to head back to malls, etc. How do you think should this problem be approached? And we're already seeing a lot of knee-jerk kind of interventions where people are getting sprayed with all kinds. They were getting sprayed with all kinds of stuff. Then it got outlawed. And there's like a lot of checks that you have to go through. We don't even know if those work. So, is there a better way to do this, Anirban?
If I had an answer to that, how much would you pay me?
Name your price. The world is your oyster.
Okay, so I think right now, again, I think I mentioned this earlier. I'm somebody who's not too worried about solutions. I'd rather spend time finding the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and when we work with our clients around the world, we are seeing that there is a gap in the way the world is perceiving this disruption. Corporate bosses around the world are tom-tomming about high performance and productivity and meetings ending on time, and it's all great because I was reading somewhere that pretty much every Indian company is going to save 3 to 5% on commute cost and electricity bills. So everybody's happy. Flip it around and you talk to human beings who are at the receiving end of Zoom calls, and you realize there's desolation. Human beings were not designed for living in isolation. Solitary confinement is our punishment, right? Mm-hmm. And while the initial euphoria was great that I don't have to cross Kyarpuram or Silk Board, if for those of us in Bangalore, people are telling us that we are missing travel, we are missing commuting. At 5 o'clock in the evening, I would get up, close my laptop, and that is my end, a psychological end to my work day. And even if that means I have a 2-hour commute, heck, I'm missing it today. Just today, I was reading somewhere, I think on social media, that people are now doing fake commutes, like these flights to nowhere are happening to simulate people's flying experiences. You're actually just getting into a cab, getting stuck in a traffic jam and coming back because your offices are closed. So I think the psychological problems that are emerging out of this, Satya Nadella talked about it long before anyone else, that the impact of this is going to be massive. Mm-hmm. So I think what we are seeing, and again, you guys are in the urban space or the real estate space, you're probably also hearing that. I know that you guys would love to get people back to offices, or at least therefore they can justify buying new office space. But I don't see that happening in any near future. Many of my clients, many of the guys that I work out of in Bangalore, Gurgaon, Hyderabad, Mumbai, etc., are looking at probably a hybrid solution, where 3 days a week, people will work from home and twice a week, they'll come to office. And that also, we're already seeing it in with a bunch of my clients in Bangalore, where they're doing it, they've got a roster running that only about 10% of the manpower is showing up at any given point in time. So that The distancing norms and the occupation norms are maintained. A lot of companies I know in various tech parks, etc., are extensively redesigning their workspaces as we speak. Earlier, if I would run a training program, you would easily have 20, 30 people into a room. So now you either have a bigger room or you have lesser people. Both involve costs. So, but of course, if you are an MNC, you probably that's the last thing you're worried about so much. So I think a lot of those redesigning is happening, but I think it's important to understand that this is not going away.
It's not, and actually that's a place where I would love to ask Naresh. Getting less number of people into a room that was designed for 50. So you've never designed a space with a pandemic in mind, right?
Yeah.
So how do you now repurpose all these buildings and spaces that we've already built?
Okay, I think everybody is jumping the gun, right? And just give you a little bit, let's go back in time to understand one of the, I think, design thinking logic is never forget about past experiences, right? Past experience tends to inform future, whatever you want to do in the future. And when did the last time that we were faced with a issue like this? Not exactly the same thing, but this is roughly after 9/11, right?
Mm-hmm.
You remember what happened after 2001? That every time you went somewhere, your car boot was opened. Every time you were frisked before entering a space, your individual privacy. I remember going all the way into an aeroplane and seeing my friend off on a flight. Right? And I've actually sat in pilots' cabins and all and flown with them when they were my friends. Right? So things that you took for granted till a point that you walked into any public building or any public space without so much as nobody asked you any question, changed dramatically the moment a terrorist angle came into the whole thing. This guy is just a terrorist in the air, that's all. So we have to find ways, people will find ways to deal with it. And one of the terms I detest is this post-COVID scenario. No? There is no post-COVID scenario.
Sure.
Right? There is a post-vaccine scenario. People start talking about the moment you find a vaccine. And again, we'll take a rain check on this and we can do this again in June. And I predict by June next year, right? Everything will go back to hyper normal because there will be such an accelerated vaccination program that will happen that already I feel that Bangalore is starting to reach herd immunity levels. I'm tracking the figures on a daily basis. And yesterday, 4 people died in the whole city, by the way, just so that you all know. And it's been like that for the past 10 days. We've had 3 days in which we have had single-digit deaths due to COVID in the whole city. And the thing is starting to, and I ask always people, do you know what the morbidity of dengue fever is? Right? You can get dengue, right? I'm sure all of you get bit by at least 1 mosquito per day. Like living in Bangalore, that's a reasonable average. I think there are more mosquitoes. How much sleep have you lost thinking you'll die of dengue? Almost nothing. But the dengue morbidity is 4 to 5%. Compared to COVID morbidity is 1.5% of people, the CFR rate, the fatality rate is very much lower. So sometimes when the problem is new, the reaction is also over the top. I feel that you need to be careful. Obviously, don't do stupid things like going into an air-conditioned room with 50 other people. But at the same time, rushing to redesign and make huge changes. You have to, I think, do what you can and redistribute your resources so that, like what Anirban saying, instead of a 30 people training program, you do a 10 people training program. But you can't suddenly come up with 3 times the space, which will go waste in 6 months' time. So let's not jump the gun and predict like total disaster or a major change. There will be permanent changes. Every time from now on for the next 10 years, you'll have to use sanitizer before you go into any building or a space. There will be a thermometer, there will be a temperature scan when you walk in. These are all minor things. These are not going to really break your routine too much. And if you go to many of the public places in Bangalore, people are behaving like that there's no problem at all. And whenever I see something like that, I run away from that place because I know that a herd, if herd immunity hasn't developed, at least herd behavior has started developing, saying that, oh, these are friends, we can't possibly get COVID from my friend, kind of idiotic. It's almost like a willing suspension of disbelief. What did Jobs call it, Anirban? Jobs would create something like what is called a reality distortion field around him when he talks, right? He used to convince people that whatever he was saying was the perfect thing. That's what will happen. And we should be ready with answers to what happens if they don't find a vaccine.
Right.
But it's unlikely, because just like you pointed out, just like technology is going to influence construction and real estate as we go along, technology has created, to create a vaccine. I work with the pharmaceutical industry a lot, right? In new drug discovery and development, we work with a lot of them. And the usual process of finding a new molecule is about 5 years minimum, and about 10 years before it comes into the market after multiple tests. Using a combination of CRISPR technology, using a combination of computational pharmacokinetics and computational technologies, as well as the ability to quickly sequence. A virus in the end has only finite amount of RNA particles. It's not like DNA. Right? Now, a DNA test is available for your entire genome in 48 hours. A virus will take 2 hours to sequence the entire. So this is the power of computation, the power of technology, and the power of, if you would wish to call it, innovation and invention, which has caused a vaccine. Today morning, Pfizer announced a 90% success rate. Within 1 year of the virus coming out, we have possible solutions. And I believe that by about March or April, after the first lot of the high-risk people are vaccinated, and we start seeing actual studies of the pharmacokinetics of the vaccine, how it actually reacts in a real-world situation. By June or so, I think we're all jumping the gun, trying to, I think, just be careful, be safe, don't be stupid, and make sure that you are keep the flag flying till June, July of next year. Definitely by the end of next year, there will be both a drug to treat it as well as a vaccine. We haven't got it yet.
So we're almost coming to the top of the hour, and while we open it up for Q&A, there's a Q&A box at the bottom for everyone if you have any questions for our panelists. And while that comes up, I wanted to quickly get in a last question to both of you on something that I know is very close to your hearts, both of you, right? Sustainability. And so for Naresh, is it a part of the brief for an architecture design, and from an architecture design and construction point of view? I mean, what are the constraints that we are saddled with that prevents us from doing much better than where we are at today? I know you touched upon the politics angle.
It's no longer an either or. Okay, let's be very clear. The only kind of buildings or cities that you will build from now on are sustainable cities.
Right.
It's not an either or situation. One. Two is, it's a question of long-term value analysis over short-term capital outflows. Most real estate is only focused on one thing: how much it costs. Right? It's not focused on usability. It is not focused on evolution, and it is not focused. And people don't understand that a badly built building costs any building for that matter, costs 10 times as much to maintain it in its life as the capital expense. Right? And the money you make from that project is actually comes over the life of the project. Whether you sell it or, whether it's by proxy or you are renting it out, right? If you're going to spend 10 times the money that you're going to spend for as much as the capital expense for building a project, I would rather spend 150% in the beginning to be able to spend 1/10 as much maintaining it. So people don't understand that, but unfortunately, the whole industry is fixated on how much we are spending right here and now. That has to change in the mind of the real estate developer. And you find that that is quickly changing in the newer generation of developers and in the more enlightened generation of the older ones. You don't find this, and you don't find that kind of thinking anymore. People understand the value of what is called life cycle analysis for a project. And tech is playing a huge role, right, in energy management. Earlier, it was an esoteric field full of spreadsheets. Now you get cool looking dashboard saying you're wasting, don't put on your hot water heater between this time and that time. You're wasting too much power on XYZ, you're wastefully going up and down. And slowly, the house of the era of the McMansion, the wasteful, the equivalent of a McDonald's burger is a building called a McMansion, is coming to an end. And people and the greatest denier of climate change is now hunkered in the White House and not leaving it very easily. But it's very clear that climate change, right, is going to fundamentally you can see this year itself, the kind of excessive rainfalls we are getting, the strange weather we are having. The world is changing, and I think the human beings are finally starting to make an impact on the whole planet. And also, but what the fun part of human beings, you saw in the lockdown, right? There was a telling picture of the Yamuna River on March 22nd, and there was a telling picture of the Yamuna River on April 2nd. Did you see those two images? One which is completely dark and pitch black with just like our Bellandur Lake, foam floating. And in 10 days after a lockdown, there are fish swimming in it and the water is blue and the sky is nice and clean. So the capacity of nature to renew itself is very, very strong. And it is the greatest failure of our learnings from this COVID crisis if we do not learn that nature may not have an infinite capability to reverse itself, but it still does. And if we can somehow make that happen and not make sustainability an either or decision, it should become a must-have decision. And buildings must go through a life cycle analysis when you assess how much it's going to cost to create, including the embedded carbon, which is going into a project like every project. I think life will go on, things will become better.
Great. Anirban, you have something to add there?
No, I think Naresh has covered pretty much all that I needed to say. I wish I could share his optimism towards human beings healing the planet. I hope he's right, and I hope both of us are alive long enough to have a drink over it. I think David Attenborough, in his recent documentary, A Life on the Planet, A Life on Our Planet, brilliantly put it that, we just have to do three things: renew your forests, change your food, and change your fuel, pretty much, and you're done. So, and he talks about success stories. Now, bring it back to sustainability. I think we are seeing a huge focus on sustainability in pretty much everything we're working on. And again, I won't step into the real estate space because I wouldn't know that space so much. But when it talks of tech, when we talk about waste, when we talk about packaging material, just to give you an example, I remember a few years ago when we had one of our Bangalore floods, I remember reading about it, that a lot of the drains were blocked by packing material, styrofoam and packing boxes that came from the typical e-commerce delivery services. And I was in the middle of a project with one of them at that point in time. And I remember bringing up this conversation and it created a furor. There was a huge conversation around it. Surprisingly, the same company invests a lot of money back in the US on biodegradable packaging material, but somehow it hadn't at that point in time filtered down to India. But I think what we are now seeing with, again, what you talked about in terms of in the development space, we're seeing it with companies coming in, with I think newer age organizations coming in. And also what's changing is the nature of leadership. But I would always point out that also changing is the nature of the customer. When you have a millennial customer, when you have a post-millennial customer, I think one of the greatest, if you go back to the man, the greatest climate denier, whatever number of votes he won, probably what swung the votes against him were, of course, Black Americans and younger Americans who were essentially pro-life, pro-choice. And I think when their anger is triggered, they come out and they vote or they buy based on their emotional drives. Now, it's very important for companies to understand, how do we plug in? Tomorrow is a building that promises a lower carbon footprint likely to sell its apartments more than one that doesn't talk about it? And does that therefore motivate the developer to look at that angle and work towards it, not just in terms of the advertising of it, but in terms of actually building that footprint? And we are already seeing that. I was talking to you, I think, Gautam, a few days back. One of our clients in UK is this major retail to gas station to banking giant. And we discovered through our research that a lot of post-millennial customers are going away from large banks to newer banks that are coming in because large banks are investing in fossil fuel companies. And because of those ethical causes, they are refusing to put money in those banks. So I think, will that happen in real estate, in the sense I will only buy a property or take an office in a building that promises all that Naresh is promising? And if it is, then I think that's the greatest driver for change.
Anirban, it's already happening in the commercial space.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is.
Because
You know far more than me.
The lower cost of maintenance is only possible when you invest in sustainable technologies.
Naresh, I'm absolutely with you. And I'm delighted if it is. I'm just saying what you said, right? How do you mainstream this? How does it become the norm rather than some doing it? To me, it's the market that's probably going to drive
How
it.
does it come to the residential sector where, you know, the builder builds and eventually goes away, but, you know, it's the resident that now has to have the burden of maintaining it over the life of the building? That's the problem that we're continuously looking at solving.
The same financial incentive will work there. No, the cost of one of the biggest nuisances of after you buy a building is the cost of maintenance.
Exactly.
If you're able to prove that the cost of maintenance of a project, I mean, the monthly payout that you all make is much less compared to a similar benchmark elsewhere, there is definitely a selling point. I mean, we don't mind spending 1 crore to buy an apartment, but if you get a 3,000 buck bill for your electricity and water, it bugs you no end. And if that becomes $1,000 a month, somehow that psychologically plays on people's. I've noticed that people are very unwilling to spend small amounts of money
on a continual basis.
Rather than one
time. I'll just give you an example. I'm on a high rise. I look out of my balcony. 10 years ago, the number of solar panels on the roofs all around me were probably a fraction of what it is today. And I think that's exactly the whole point. It's not that suddenly everybody's become more environmentally conscious, but the cost probably has a significant amount to do with that, as well as desires of changing customers.
There's probably also a regulatory reason for that, but absolutely. I mean, I do agree with you.
So a question to both of you, given that we're coming towards the end, what would be your advice to startups who are in sustainability sector, in prop tech sector? Because I think these are specifically problems, and I have a couple of examples, but maybe that's for a different day. But what would you advise? How should they look at this? Because sustainability is becoming the norm, but it's a glass ceiling that they have to still break. So how should they go about it? Any thoughts? And related to that, there's a question from the audience. They've asked, what is the possibility of collaboration with entrepreneurs from Africa? They've asked specifically for design thinking, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that specifically. Maybe
Naresh.
Anirban,
okay, me? Okay. I think we work with startups in different sectors, incubators, accelerators, etc. I always recommend that you start with the why question early and try to find the problem you're trying to solve. Do you, because I remember reading this report, and it's not about your sector per se, but overall in the startup space, that close to 100% of startup founders create their companies based on their personal experience or personal pain. Zero look at problems to solve. I would be happy to be proven wrong, but this is data from Google from 2015. And I would be delighted if that's irrelevant here. My point is, if you're talking about my advice, it's something that I give for people in the tech space or healthcare space. Understand the problem, and understand the problem from the human experience perspective. Not to save money, save a few dollars here or a few hours there. If you can understand the larger context, I always surprisingly use Eliel Saarinen's quote that think of a house in a city, furniture in a room, etc. Understand the context of the human life where your product will sit or hit. you'll probably be able to find more meaningful problems to solve, and that probably will get you greater success in the long term. That's my quick 10 minutes past 5 answer.
All right. Naresh, what do you...
Let me answer a question on the screen instead, right? So, what is the future of virtual reality? Somebody has asked in the real estate area, right? Let me try and answer that.
Okay.
It's very disorienting. To develop a tandem solution where I'm able to take the client for a walk instead of showing him plans and elevations, right? And most clients get totally disoriented and feel high nausea using such a, though it looks like a great technology and it should be the future of design. I would think that more, if you, like what Anirban pointed out, if you don't look at varieties of user experience, to use a literary term, right? People feel very nauseous and disoriented using this kind of stuff. But if you use something like more like what I call augmented reality, where the real world is also visible with extra information thrown into it, with a sense of grounding, I think maybe that is the future. However, in the larger sense, very little, the internet as well as technologies to reform real estate has not made much of an impact in the sector still. It's a wide open space. We're already seeing huge inputs coming in from the surveying and monitoring project management spaces. We're also finding very, very useful design tools which run off the cloud, which are able to visualize designs very, very quickly, etc. And we're also finding bits and pieces. We're not still finding the thing that ties them all together. And more importantly, we're not finding real estate developers and clients who are willing to pay us for this deployment of this. I always make that analogy saying Xerox machines came to India in 1970. We bought the first one only in the year 2000. Why? Because nobody is paying us extra to keep a Xerox machine inside my office. It is always cheaper to send it out and pay 1 rupee a copy. Only when people are willing to say that, from it either becomes cheap enough for you to afford, or if a client is willing to pay for the extra service that you are able to do using technology, or able to at least defray the costs of putting this technology out, only then will there be mass acceptance. Otherwise, it's difficult to cross that first Rubicon of acceptance by the client.
Fair enough. Thanks. I know there's another question that has come in. Very quickly, if, maybe in 30 seconds to a minute. What are your thoughts on vertical farming, hydroponics as a sustainable food growing method as a part of urban space?
Just one line answer. The second largest food exporting country in the world. Does anybody know what it is? It's
Netherlands.
It's the Netherlands.
Netherlands, yeah.
Netherlands is slightly bigger than, smaller than Karnataka, half of Karnataka. Okay, if they can do it, obviously it succeeds. And the only thing we have to be careful of is that we don't pump the plant full of strange chemicals and growth hormones to already create more of a problem than already is there. And already there is a startup in Koramangala here, which I saw recently, called Woolly Farms or something, which is already showing that in an urban setting, it is an HSR layout of all things. In a small urban site, they're starting to prove that it can be done. And right now, the way we do farming is a completely wasteful, water wasting method. Actually, India has no water problem. It has a water usage problem, right? You fundamentally find that there's lots of water, but we waste, as usual, like many other things, 80% of it without thinking what is a renewable resource. The moment the pressure comes that there is no more water, sometimes technology gets a boost because of that.
Fair enough. Thanks. I think let me, thank you so much. I think I'll just, like to probably make one final comment. I think design thinking seems like a good framework for sure. Definitely not the magic one that is sometimes made out to be though. Real estate stakeholders, PropTech, startups, design thinkers don't meet too often on a common ground and rarely do business together, if any. Perhaps they should come together as we build sustainable infrastructure in coming years. And for startups, I think focus on problems is, I think, one thing that came up from both of you. I think don't just build solutions, but focus on problems. Ask the why question. And sustainability is not an option anymore. I think it's something that's coming out very clearly as well. It's a mandate, it's going to happen. And here is my plug for REAP. At REAP, our applications are open and we are looking for very, very interesting companies, startups that are solving problems for prop tech, for sustainability, clean tech, renewables, and so on. So thank you once again, each and every one of you, and especially Naresh and Anirban, for taking this time out to be with us.